It's Vocab Malone. I'm with my good friend Eddie Dalcour. He's an apologist.
I'm sorry.
He's strong, but like all of us, he used to be stronger.
Is that really?
It's all of us. He's Italian, Sicilian specifically.
It's just, yeah, make sure you differentiate that.
Yes. And he's a master storyteller. Now, I don't know if you guys will get to see all those sides of my friend. Now, he's drinking his hotel coffee. Earlier, I made espresso. Which one is better?
Espresso or espresso?
Espresso.
No
And you
X.
got to drink it like this.
I did that.
Which one is better, though? The hotel coffee?
Yours, no,
All right.
definitely yours with all the sugar.
So, I've been telling Eddie a little bit about the Hebrew Israelites and some of the stuff that they say in relationship to the KJV. And you've written a book on the KJV and done a lot of stuff on it?
I've written a pamphlet. It's on my website.
So he likes to differentiate a pamphlet. We'll call it that.
Yeah.
So today we're going to give the viewers a little bit of introduction to the King James Version of the Bible, some of the issues associated with that, specifically things related to translation, things related to the history of the text, some things related to the Greek and the Hebrew, things like that. And that'll give a good groundwork for then we're going to discuss some of the things that some Hebrew Israelites and other cultists say about the King James Version of the Bible. So we want to today separate fact from fiction.
Lots of fiction.
So briefly, Eddie, what is the King James Version of the Bible?
Now, of course, in our small window of time, we can't go through every single point of the King James Bible, but basically it is a translation. No one can deny the literary magnitude of that translation. It was used for hundreds of years. It was used by all the reformers, right? But
the English reformers. That's a point that I do want to make. So we're both reformed, and we believe that a lot of the ideas that were brought out in the Reformation were correct because they were biblical. And sometimes it's important to note that the English Reformation, a lot of that, they were dealing with the KJV, but that's just the English Reformation.
English side of it, yeah.
Obviously, the Italian Reformation, and which was much smaller, is my understanding, but nonetheless, and the Swiss and the French and German, they weren't using the KJV.
No. Of course, it's asserted by KJV only unless you learn English. To learn to read the King James, you would never get the gospel.
So you just said KJV only. What is KJV only?
Briefly, and my position is not against, as you, not against the King James Bible. As I was saying, it's a beautiful translation.
That one right here.
Yeah, I mean, who in the world has ever heard the Lord's Prayer cited outside of a King James Bible? I mean, whatever church you're in, whatever translation they use. However, we're against the King James only position that asserts either the Greek text, the Textus Receptus, upon which the King James was based, or the KJV itself is an infallible. It's the only correct translation. It's an inerrant translation, which would really lead to the conclusion that Desiderius Erasmus was infallible and inerrant, since he was the architect of the Greek text of the Textus Receptus.
Let me ask this. What is, I know it sounds funny, but let's define some basics. What is a Bible translation? What is that?
Simply, Bible translation is going from the original Greek text. Let's deal with the New Testament.
Okay.
The Greek Testament was written in Greek.
And you've got one right over there, right?
Yeah, right. This is the critical edition. The original New Testament was written in Greek. And because of missionary efforts and so on and so forth. So
missionaries want people to know the Word of God in their language, so they translate from the Greek in their own language, the New Testament, into the people's language so they can hear the Word of God in their own tongue, just like Acts chapter 2.
And just like the Septuagint. That's exactly what happened.
What's the Septuagint?
It's the Greek translation of the Old Testament.
Which is written in Hebrew, primarily.
Which was written in Hebrew. A lot of Jews coming out of the exile, they didn't know how to read Hebrew. But they knew how to read Greek. So a couple hundred years or so before Christ, we have this translation. It started out just the Torah of the Hebrew into Greek, so they can read it. But why the Septuagint is most significant is because the New Testament authors quoted from it primarily as their source when they're citing Old Testament passages.
Which makes sense if you think about it. The New Testament authors are writing in Greek, and they're quoting a Greek translation of the Bible. They're not randomly inserting Hebrew into a Greek text as they write the New Testament or anything like that. Now, you mentioned the Textus Receptus. What is the Textus Receptus, and how is it relevant in a discussion of the King James Version of the Bible?
It's interesting because some people pronounce it as the Texas, like it came from Texas.
Oh, like the Texas? Yeah.
Textus Receptus.
Straight from Dallas, ladies and gentlemen.
Basically, the Textus Receptus is not one Greek edition. It's a version of the compilation of several different men. And they're based on, their text was based on late manuscripts.
Okay, so these are later biblical manuscripts of the Greek and the Hebrew, and they were collated together and then put into a printed Greek edition when we're talking about the New Testament.
Right.
And you'd said several different men were involved with this, and you mentioned earlier Erasmus. He would have been one of these men.
He was the first. Deficiencies Erasmus, 1516, printed the first Greek New Testament. Before that, no one has actually printed it in publication.
Yeah, I mean, you had back Origen you had people do something similar, but that was actually copying it way back then.
Yeah, this was an actually published work.
So you'd have to have the printing press for this to happen, and you'd have to have some access to at least more than one Greek manuscript, which he did. And when we mentioned Erasmus, he's roughly contemporaneous with Martin Luther. By the way, we're Reformed. We are not worshiping this. This is not an idol. It is a plush doll. Okay, continue on. So what is the TR?
So now keep in mind that the phrase Textus Receptus came much later. Came actually after the King James Bible was printed, and it was an advertising blurb. It came about around 1633 by the Alxavier. Some people would say they're brothers. They weren't brothers. One was Bonaventure, and his nephew Abraham had a printing press, and they weren't actually editors. I mean, they weren't actually the writers.
They were just the publishers.
They were just the publishers.
And so it was marketing that said this is the Textus Receptus.
The text received by all.
Right.
And it became, known, that Greek edition or version became known as the Textus Receptus.
It caught on, kind of like when people refer to something that you sneeze in as a Kleenex.
Yeah.
But it's not a Kleenex. That's a brand name.
Exactly. and it really did, even today, people use that to refer to the Greek text upon which the King James Bible was translated. But the problem is, if you look at the architects of the TR, it wasn't one person.
Right.
It was Deficiencies Erasmus, Theodore Beza, Stephanus.
Another reformer, by the way. Okay, yeah.
They all took part in several different translations, several different editions of the Greek text.
So sometimes a more sophisticated, not necessarily King James only advocate, but someone who's close to that position, but it has a more sophisticated position, might say, I'm TR only.
Right.
And which we might say is a more respectable position, I guess, than KJV only. But we also would want to ask them, which TR do you mean?
Yes, I was asked that question. I think there was at least from 1516 to around 78, I think was the last printed edition of the Elseviers. At least 30 different printed editions. So when you're talking the TR, the question is, well, which one? Deficiencies or Theodore Beza? Or was it Stephanus? The problem is they differed on many different passages. So there's no uniformity between them on every single passage. You know.
Well, okay, let's do this. We were talking about we might make more than one of these videos, and we were speaking about how what we might do is break them up into chunks. I think it'd be a great idea for the first video essentially to sort of lay some of the basic foundation or framework or whatever, kind of set the stage, and then in the next video, we'll actually play a video by, I'm going to be specific here, a Black Hebrew Israelite leader named Rakah, Elder Rakah, he calls himself, of the GOCC, which is the Gathering of Christ Church. I'm going to play some of that for Eddie Dalcour, and we're going to interact with it. And what we want to do is help you sort out the fact from the fiction. So before we stop this one to go to the next one, I want to make sure we've laid out most of the basic issues as far as this idea of the King James Version being the only version. What else is maybe something people might need to know, or that you like to bring to the foreground, or maybe important questions, anything like that?
I would say two things. Number one, all translations are really secondhand information.
Right.
They're all secondhand information, and every translation must be analyzed in light of the Greek text, not the other way around.
Right.
Many KJV will actually interpret the Greek in the light or basis of the KJV. And they interpret all translations in light of the mighty KJV.
Right. And that is decidedly backwards almost by definition.
Right.
Anything else that people do need to know before we end this video to go to the next one?
Yeah, and one more point. What you have in the KJV, as mentioned, there's not one KJV that's identical.
Why is that?
Because there was printing errors. There was mainly because of printing errors. Same with the TR. There was differences in the TR. There was not one TR or a version of the Greek text of these men who were the architects of it that were identical.
Right.
You know.
That shot right there. Check it. See, that was perfect.
That was good.
See, that was awesome. I don't think I actually ever knew what you just said.
Just made it up.
Talk a little bit.
Hello. KJV is the only infallible rule of faith for biblical translations. It must be embraced. It must be worshipped.